So I'd like to talk about neurons, and I'm particularly thinking of this from a neural network context. And one of the things we're often used when we think about neurons is we talk about having a whole bunch of inputs, and there's a whole bunch of weights or synapses. And then we'll say that the output of those synapses will typically get summed together. And then we want to think about, and that gets into some sort of neuron block. Now, an interesting thing happens even when I look at a biological neuron is that I'll have inputs, they'll come into through biological synapses, those axons will come into it, so that way it makes a connection into this overall larger neuron cell. And there will be a summation, although a little more complicated than summation, but there'll at least be a summation through this process. All right. So I want to think about this a little bit more physically than typically the way this is, might be approached in a purely mathematical sense, but clearly historically this is the way we think about it. Because I'm going to talk about having an input going through some weighting element, and then I'm going to take the outputs and they're all going to get summed together, but I'm doing it in a slightly different way here, because I'm talking about having outputs being a current and having a whole set of currents and having a one line, and somehow the sum comes out, some of it. Now, what you might remember if you've done circuits is there's this wonderful law called Kirchhoff's current law. And basically what it means is that all the current going in has to equal all the current going out. And it makes sense, right? Because there's no storage of charge in the middle nodes and stuff, unless you have a capacitance explicitly there, and so on, and you can grow that. But not worrying about that for the moment, what you'd say is that all the current going in equals all the current going out. Well, if I set it up such saying all of the current going in is all of, everything minus one of them, and one of them is just the output, well, that's going to give me an output that's the sum of all the inputs. And you think, okay, that's a very straightforward thing, but it's a wonderful approach for doing summation. And summation, that's actually a physical law. And this happens to show up in many cases, whether it be, current or ions moving in a fluid, such as you see in neurons, or in other kind of places. And so there's a huge amount of possibility there. And so what you can imagine, say, taking all of these currents, and I just draw it as a line, and you'll see this often in a lot of the neural network literature as well, which sort of belies the fact that it has these physical roots. It has these roots that go back to neuroscience, go back to some level of circuits that are very important in its structure. And what you can find is that all the currents have to equal to the sum, and so there's just a straight sum of these things. And in fact, you'd look at each of these individual currents as I1 to be times some weight times x1. What you might actually expect is this might eventually be something like a conductance or a transconductance kind of number times a voltage. And this is a very typical approach and leads to some very nice structures in sort of a mesh infrastructure, a mesh architecture. That's been kind of understood for several decades at this point. And there's a lot of opportunities you can build out of that. It does make an interesting connection to the dendritic modeling, even though the dendrite's not a wire, at least you're starting to talk about physical summation. You're beginning to open up the possibility of, well, could there be more? And what would that look like? And you have a framework to do that. And it also then says I've got a current coming into the neuron, and then I work with it from there. Now, it may just be I take that current and I just threshold it. That's typical of what you would have seen in McCullough and Pitt's neuron going from sort of 1943, and very much the way they were thinking about it. It could also end up being a sigmoidal structure, sort of saying, well, the output action potentials I might have gotten in a biological neuron, I'm just going to I'm going to average over them. I could end up talking about what is I can ask what's sort of the integral of that function, which gives you a lot of the rectifying functions. Different types of nonlinearities give you different opportunities. So some neat stuff there. And it certainly also modeling does allow you to completely think about an integrated fire neuron, which typically have a current input, or even more biological channel models. So this perspective tends to be pretty useful, across a range of different ideas in these sorts of neural network, neuromorphic modeling, neuroscience modeling, machine learning, and so forth. So kind of useful to kind of get used to these kinds of ideas, because it does kind of open up a lot of the possibilities that you might see.